Hello, my name is Ralph Amos, President and CEO of the Caltech Alumni Association and the Assistant Vice President of Alumni Relations at Caltech. Good afternoon to you, or if it's morning for you, we are so delighted to have you join us for this, our 85th Seminar Day at Caltech. The equity of your Caltech degree continues to increase in value. It's because we have a 25,000 base alumni around the world that's coming together in ways never before seen. Yes, there's been a lot of difficult things to deal with the pandemic, but with it, we found leveraging technology, we are able to connect 24/7 in great places like France and Ireland, China, and Japan. It is also important that we work to continue strengthening the community and connecting to each other to ensure the success and well-being of our lives, personal, professional, and intellectual. So over the coming months and years, look for more programs, services, and content intended to help you find your best sense of purpose. That's what we're dedicated to. And on behalf of the board and our staff, look for those things to enhance your lives. We are grateful for all that you do and continue to do for Caltech. Stay connected to each other and to this great place. It is now my honor to turn the program back over to our outstanding host and dedicated alumna, Sandra Singh Low. Sandra, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ralph. And also Singapore, I remember we should have mentioned internationally, and we value the alumni who are closer to home as well. All right. Well, welcome back. Kicking off the afternoon after lunch. Again, I hope you have your coffee or whatever in hand. We have 2 extraordinary hours of programming. Session 3 is Sustainability, Science, and Solutions. So Caltech's been in the news recently, as always. If you open your Caltech Weekly through your email inbox, I know as an alumna, I do. The May 5th article was about Caltech's new Resnick Sustainability Institute. This has been given by philanthropists Linda and Stuart Resnick, owner of the Wonderful Company. They've pledged, get ready for it, $750 million to Caltech for the Institute. It's the largest gift ever in the Institute's history and amongst the largest ever for environmental sustainability research. I can't resist quoting Governor Gavin Newsom on this, noting he was the only politician in the world who could get away with it. He quoted the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia. He said, "You don't want to be the best of the best. You want to be the only one that does what you do." I think that statement applies to Caltech. No one does what Caltech does. So a little Grateful Dead for you. But pivoting away from that, I should mention, California has more scientists, more researchers, Nobel laureates, venture capital, patents than any other place on the globe. So as Ralph said, your equity as an alumni or alumnus is only increasing. But back to the science. Now, we welcome Executive Director of the Resnick Sustainability Institute, long bio. I'm just going to essence down. Amongst other things, he's the former Director of Advanced Projects and the Director of Reliability and Testing for Solient Energy. He is Professor Dr. Neil Fromer. Congratulations on the new venture and welcome, Neil. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you all for being here. As Sandra said, I'm the Executive Director for the Resnick Sustainability Institute in charge of our programs here. And I have a few slides that I can share with you all. So we're at the end of the slide deck. There we go. So in actuality, we can go on to the next one. In actuality, the Resnick Sustainability Institute has been at Caltech for now 10 years, a little more than 10 years. Linda and Stuart Resnick gave their initial gift in 2009, which created the Institute through an endowed gift, which has allowed us to provide seed funding across the campus, specifically focused on getting faculty and students and postdocs and researchers from all 6 divisions to focus on research related to sustainable use of natural resources and fight against climate change. We've created a lot of programs that are basically designed to help the researchers start brand new research projects that may be a little bit hard to get funding from other places, and then to sort of help those researchers move that effort through the academic pipeline from crazy idea to something that maybe is ready to have a life off of the university campus, and then to support them in that in that transition, either through helping them understand what it takes to start a new business to commercialize the technology, or to introduce them to policymakers or other businesses that might be able to take and use that new breakthrough. As Sandra mentioned, in the last few years, the Resnicks announced a huge additional pledge to Caltech that really is designed around a massive expansion of what the Resnick Institute is capable of doing on this campus. And it allows us to expand from just giving out these sort of small seed grants to being able to support larger research initiatives, as well as to build core facilities that the campus will be able to use effectively to really amplify the work that the researchers do on campus. And so if we move on to the next slide, as we began to think about this expansion, we did what folks at Caltech do every once in a while, and we took a step back and looked around the campus and identified areas, sustainability and sustainable use of natural resources and the fight against climate change. These are big problems, and $750 million commitment is a huge one, but it's nowhere near enough to actually tackle the challenge. And so what we did was we stepped back and said, okay, what areas does Caltech have unique expertise? As Sandra mentioned when she was quoting the governor, quoting Jerry Garcia, boy, that's a lot of quotes. What things do we do uniquely different, and in a way that nobody else really approaches? And we came up with these 4 core research initiatives. We will support research on anything related to our broad mission of fighting climate change and stewarding our natural resources. But these 4 areas were areas where we realized we had unique capabilities that we could provide on campus to attack the problem. So the first one is what we call sunlight to everything. And this is really about developing new research projects that can take all of the things that we make in the world, whether that's the energy that goes into making them or the actual stuff that comes out of them, and start them from clean energy, from sunlight, and from renewable resources. So this is really about renewable energy and renewable materials and the circular economy. In addition to that, we identified areas related to climate science. This is about identifying how humans and human activity are changing the climate and helping build resilient and adaptive structures to prepare us to be able to deal with those changes. And it includes both sort of measuring and modeling and predicting how the world is changing, and then also engineering these new technologies to be able to adapt to them or to fight against them. Similarly, our water resources initiative is about increasing access to fresh water. This is something that here in California we're always acutely aware of, and now in the throes of another very large drought, even more so. Again, how can we leverage the resources that we have on campus and our unique partnership with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to build the ability to model and predict how changes in fresh water are coming and where there might be additional sources of fresh water, and then to engineer systems that allow us to make the best use of that, either through water reuse or water treatment technologies, or better ways to access water that is currently difficult to get at. And lastly, ecology and biosphere engineering. This is an attempt to sort of build up an understanding of and an ability to engineer and support ecosystems, both natural ecosystems and cultivated ecosystems. So both the natural world and also our agricultural sector, to be able to provide new tools and techniques to help develop the systems so that they're robust and healthy, and we are not losing biodiversity, and also that we are building the capability to continue to expand and feed the growing planet despite the challenges that climate change is bringing to that sector. So these are sort of 4 areas where, as we looked around campus, we thought that we were uniquely poised to do some different and interesting things. And so we built these sort of core research initiatives, and we're providing funding to support researchers across the campus that are working in these areas and other ones related to our core mission area. But we're also, and if you move on to the next slide, we're also building a brand new facility. So the governor made the remarks that Sandra mentioned at a groundbreaking that we held last week for a new a new facility on campus, the Resnick Sustainability Center. And what's going to go into this very unique building are a number of shared research facilities that will be available to the faculty and staff and students on campus that are working in these areas. And they'll specifically help them develop new tools related to understanding how to absorb solar energy and convert that solar energy into useful forms of energy that can be applied through catalysis or through other industrial processes to making the things that we need to make in the world. We have a water and environment lab, which is set up to provide the ability to test samples of water, understand the challenges related to improving the water quality and understanding the interaction between the water and the local environment that it lives in. We're building a very unique facility called the Remote Sensing Center, which is going to allow students and researchers on campus to develop instruments that can be flown on aircraft or on balloons or even on small sats and CubeSats and launched and then controlled from a control room in the new building to allow them to collect new remote sensing measurements that might help shed light on what's happening in the environment and with water and with the changing climate. And we're building an ecology and biosphere engineering facility that will allow folks to cultivate plants in controlled conditions and cultivate soil samples and understand sort of the interaction between the microbiological world that lives in the soils and the plants and the things that grow out of that soil. In addition, we're setting up a facility that will help people to scale up new technologies that they've developed in order to be able to make sure that those things can have an impact as quickly as possible. We're supporting the campus high performance computing infrastructure. And for those of you that are familiar with the campus, the building that we knocked down in order to put this new building up was Mead Laboratory, which was the home for undergraduate chemistry teaching labs. And so our new building will also contain new state-of-the-art undergraduate teaching laboratories. And because of the way the Caltech core curriculum is structured, every single student that comes through Caltech, every undergraduate student will take a chemistry class in this building and will be exposed through coming in and out of the building every day to the breadth of the great sustainability research that we're doing on campus. And so really what this expansion is allowing us to do is bend the arc of the campus towards sustainability related research in a way that has never been enabled before. And so that is sort of the very high level overview of the Resnick Institute. And we have a couple of faculty that are on tap to join us for the rest of the session. My colleagues, Gozda Demire, who's an assistant professor of chemical engineering, who actually will be officially starting in that role in the fall. And is currently up at UC Davis finishing up some other research. And Stephen Lowe, who's a professor of computing and mathematical sciences and electrical engineering here at Caltech. And they're going to talk to you about some of the research that they are doing or planning to do related to some of these challenges focused on renewable energy and sustainable use of natural resources. And after they've presented, we'll come back on and have a little discussion and answer some questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gozda.
Okay, thank you, Neil, so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Gozda Demire, and I'll be starting this fall in the Department of Chemical Engineering. So my lab will be working on developing nano and biotechnologies for improving the plant and the environment health. So I'll get started by describing you the motivation of this work, and then a bit about my past results, and then talk to you what I hope to do at Caltech. So in the next slide, unfortunately, as you all know, our food security is currently threatened. So we have a rapidly increasing human population that also increases our food consumption and food demand. So it's been predicted that by 2050, if we need to match the food demand, we need to increase our crop productivity and agricultural yield by at least up to 60%. And that number doesn't actually account for the changes that we are experiencing by the climate change. Unfortunately, climate change has extensive and expanding negative effects on the crop productivity and the crop yields. So by NASA, it was predicted in 2021 that by 2050, there are going to be severe reduction in most of our staple crops. So in maize, we are expecting around 24% reduction in crop yields, and then 14% in rice and wheat. And these reductions are estimated based on the temperature changes, as well as the extreme availability and unavailability of water, and extreme weather events that we started to experience. In addition to these abiotic factors that affect the crop yields, we also have new plant diseases and pests emerging because of the climate change. Because of the changes in the seasons and changes in temperatures, it's becoming warmer earlier, that we have these new animals, insects, pests, pathogens starting to come out earlier when we are at the critical part of the plant growth initially in the field. So because of all of these reasons, currently we are experiencing 40% loss globally of all of our crops, and that has a cost to us at around 290 billion US dollars a year. And these numbers are expected to worsen as the climate change effects are getting worse and worse. In the next slide. So what we do to deal with these changes and to increase our crop production is we keep using fertilizers, chemical fertilizers and pesticides at an unsustainable rate. Just to increase the crop yields, we keep increasing the amount of these chemical materials that we use. So if you look at some statistics here, every year we use around 400 billion pounds of chemical fertilizers and 1.5 billion pounds of pesticides. And the research shows that only around 0.1% of these chemicals interact with their target organisms, and then the rest goes and affects the other organisms in the soil and in the environment, as well as leak into the groundwater and to our seas and rivers. So most of the fertilizers, the most common fertilizers that we use are based on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the nitrogen is mostly in the form of ammonium, which we make through the energy-intensive Haber-Bosch process. But if you look at phosphate, this is an renewable resource for us. So we mine this through the rock reserves, and these reserves are estimated to deplete in the next 20 to 50 years. So both nitrogen and phosphorus are essential nutrients for plant growth. When you don't supply these, or when there isn't enough amount of these in the soil, the plants are severely limited. So you get huge reduction in their yield, in the productivity. But then the extreme usage of these chemical fertilizers have been causing a lot of drastic ecological and environmental consequences, as shown here by some eutrophication, for example, and loss of biodiversity as well. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So what we believe in our lab is that plant genetic engineering can address some of our most critical global problems that I mentioned, and many more problems. So I categorized here some big areas and applications that we can make impact using genetically engineered plants. So one area is obviously the food area. So by genetic engineering, we can create crops that are resistant to these diseases, as well as the climate change. This will not only enable us to grow more productive crops, but also be able to grow them more sustainably using less water and nutrient resources. The other field is the energy and materials, biomaterials field. We could use these genetically engineered plants to advance our biofuels, generate cleaner fuels, and then manufacture raw materials and chemicals in a more sustainable manner. In the field of medicine, we could synthesize therapeutics, vaccines in plants that are more scalable and that are more affordable. And by improving the nutritional content of these plants, we can also improve the human diet and human health. And lastly, in the environment, these engineered plants can be used for remediation efforts by increasing more capture carbon and storing carbon dioxide. So these are some fields that we can make impact by using genetically engineered plants. My lab will be mostly focused on initially on the food and environmental applications. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's a lot we can do using genetically engineered plants, but there are also really big challenges. So the biggest challenge and the first challenge we need to address is to be able to deliver biomolecular cargoes into the plant cells. And this is really challenging because plant cells have this organelle that doesn't exist in animals, for example, and that is the cell wall. So that's a really big physical barrier for the entry of any cargo inside these plant cells. And that's really the first step of any application that we want to do in the biotechnology and bioengineering field to be able to deliver useful cargoes into these plant cells. So at the bottom of the slide, you see this bacteria on a cell wall, actually. It's called Agrobacteria. So currently, this is our only way to be able to deliver DNA into the plant cells, because this bacteria is a pathogenic bacteria that has ability to deliver a piece of its DNA into the plant cells. So now, as researchers, we take advantage of this and then put in our own interested molecules in that bacteria for delivery. But it has a lot of limitations because it's a pathogenic bacteria. It can only affect and infect certain plant hosts. So this doesn't give us the ability to broadly target any plant species of interest. The other challenge is that it inserts these bacterial genes that we call transgenes into the plant genome. So then we have a lot of problems with the regulation of these plants and safe reach of these genetically engineered plants to the community because of how this bacteria inserts those genes into the plant genome. Next slide. So currently, we do have certain crops that are approved in the US that are genetically modified using this bacteria that I mentioned, Agrobacteria. You can see the list of them here, if they are produced in the US or not. But in average, these crops took around 13 years of R&D and around 136 million of a cost. And then 40 million of this cost was just because of those regulatory steps to make sure that these plants don't contain any transgenes, and because we use a pathogenic bacteria, that they are safe for human consumption. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of applications, a lot of impactful areas that these genetically engineered plants can help us improve, but then we also have great challenges, especially in the field of biomolecule delivery into the plants. Next slide. So my previous research was to address some of these challenges that I mentioned, and I used the novel approach of using engineered nanomaterials, more specifically carbon nanotubes, to be able to deliver biomolecules into plant cells. So I used these single-wall carbon nanotubes that are very short in one dimension, around 1 nanometer, and very high in other dimension, around 700 nanometer. So these are really unique materials that are very stiff, tough materials, one of the toughest materials that you can find. We call them nanoneedles because they are so short. They can easily enter the plant cells through the cell wall, the gaps in the cell wall, but they're also long enough so we can load a lot of cargoes on them. So here I'm showing the loading of, for example, a DNA, a cargo that we want to deliver on their surface, and then delivering them into plant leaves. So through this approach, we can express proteins very efficiently. As shown here, this is a fluorescent protein as a reporter to make sure that our system is working. So we can express proteins very efficiently using this nanoparticles. And then one of the biggest benefits of this technology is that because it doesn't rely on any bacteria or any pathogen, we could actually work with a lot of different crop species. And then we have shown a variety of plants that we can express cargoes using our nanoparticle technology. The other biggest advantage is that this expression is transient. So we see expression for up to the maximum expression at around day 3, and then this expression disappears by day 10. So this tells us that the DNA we are delivering is not getting inserted into the plant genome. So this is really good in terms of regulation. As I was mentioning, it's completely transient and there is no insertion of transgenes or bacterial genes. So we are really thinking that the plants engineered this way should be easier to regulate and should be able to reach the markets faster and cheaper and quicker as well. So we took this system one step further and actually performed CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, a gene knockout, to show that we could actually use this not to deliver fluorescent DNA, but also DNA that could edit the genome of these plants plants. And then here we just knocked out a pigment gene, so then the leaves turn white. But this shows us proof of concept that we could edit genes that will improve plants for the applications that I mentioned in climate change and crop productivity improvement. So in summary, this is a universal tool that can be used in many crops and that will have minimal regulatory burden of generating engineered plants that we can take to the market quickly and without needing to go through a lot of regulatory steps. So now I want to mention what my lab is going to be working on at Caltech. Next slide, please. So as Neil mentioned, we are a very new lab. We are starting this fall at Caltech, and our main aim is to not only improve the plant health, but also improve the environment health at the same time. And we use a lot of interdisciplinary approaches stemming from chemistry, material science, biology, and engineering. Next slide. So I've categorized some of our projects under three main areas. There is one area of nanotechnology where we are hoping to deliver genes and proteins for CRISPR-Cas9 editing, so the continuation of the work that I mentioned, to improve crops for climate resiliency and to be able to grow them using less resources. The next area that I call is biotechnology and synthetic biology. So in this area, we hope to do the gene manipulation and gene editing in a more precise manner and control the spatiotemporal properties of this gene expression and editing, because we don't want to have mutated plants in the field that are always taking an action. We want them to take an action when and where it's needed so that the burden on these plants are lower, as well as we believe this is a way to go forward to make sure that they're going to be able to survive in the field. So we'll develop technologies to be able to do this controlled, fine-tuned expression that we hope to take into the field. And lastly, there is a field of environment as well as rhizosphere engineering. So rhizosphere is the portion of the soil where you have the plant roots together with microbes in the soil, where a lot of important processes are taking place. So plants are not just by themselves in the soil, so they interact with a lot of microbes. Some of them are beneficial, helping them recover water as well as nutrients, but some of them are pathogenic. So we want to be able to understand these interactions so that we can engineer these interactions to be to make the plants more productive. So what I want to do here is to give two examples from this environment rhizosphere area, examples of projects that we are hoping to carry on early on in the lab. Next slide. So the first project that I'm going to mention today is actually funded by the Resnick Sustainability Institute very recently. This is a collaborative project between 4 PIs at Caltech, and our main goal is to be able to monitor the important microbial activity in soil by using sentinel plants. So our idea here is to be able to see what's happening in the soil that is potentially contributing to greenhouse gas emission. In this agricultural field, we have a lot of methane emission, nitrous oxide, gas emission, but it's hard to be able to see these processes that are under soil. So we want to develop systems where we can use a satellite or a drone over these fields and then say when there's a red plant, that field is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, so then we can take action on these fields to improve our practices of using maybe more sustainable approaches to eliminate these greenhouse gas emissions. But we first need to have a way of knowing how this is happening. So this project involves a lot of engineering of bacteria as well as plants and developing novel ways of looking into the soil without actually digging up soil from the agricultural fields. So we're really excited to get started on this project, which is just starting this summer. Next, we have another project in the lab that we are hoping to start, and this is in the field of engineered living materials for sustainable agriculture. So what we mean by engineered living materials is these materials that have living cells in them, such as bacteria, plants. You could basically put anything in there. So we hope to initially encapsulate some plant beneficial microbes, some bacteria, and polymeric hydrogels that are responsive to the environmental conditions. So we want to be able to release these, open up these gels and release our cargoes, say when there's drought in the field or nutrient scarcity, or when there's a pathogen affecting a plant. And then we'll encapsulate cargoes in here, not only plant beneficial microbes, but we could also put put in there some plant growth and defense-inducing molecules that will be released only around the plants and only when it's needed. So this will, of course, improve the plant productivity, but also this will allow us to use less of those chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So hopefully will allow us to be able to grow more productive plants using less water and nutrient resources. Next slide. So I just wanted to briefly give some examples of our project in the environment as well as food field, and we are starting this fall. So thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions in our Q&A session. So next up, we have Professor Stephen Lowe.
Hi, welcome. My name is Stephen Lowe of EAS, and I will talk about smart grid and smart EV charging. Let's see, it advances. Okay, great. 84% of our greenhouse gases is due to energy use. And of this energy use, if we look at just two activities, sorry, it's advancing slowly. Electricity generation and transportation, these two activities, they consume about 2/3 of all primary energies in the US. So they include coal, gas, nuclear, petrol, hydro, and renewables. And they emit more than 55% of all greenhouse gases in the US. If we want to drastically reduce greenhouse gases, then we have to electrify transportation, and we have to generate our electricity from clean, renewable sources. So my lab has been focused on these two activities. And today I'll tell you a little bit about one of the projects we have on electrified transportation. But if we look at the cost of renewable generations, the PV module price has been decreasing dramatically over the last few decades. In 1976, it was $79 per watt, and today is less than 30 cents per watt. And in fact, if we look at the next slide, okay. So international energy agencies will do a World Energy Outlook every year, and in that they predict the solar adoption. And there are multiple curves, one for the prediction in different years for each year. The actual trajectory is this black curve. The good news is that we have been outperforming our prediction consistently. If we look at the next slide. Okay, so this is the cost curve for lithium-ion batteries for electronics, for electric vehicles, residential storage, and also utility storage. If we look at the electric vehicle curve, then the cost has also been dropping quite rapidly. In 2010, it was 1,000 kilowatt per hour, and today is less than $300 per kilowatt hour. Next slide. And if we look at the wind capacity, for example, wind capacity in the US has exceeded in 2016 the hydro capacity that has been built up over decades. And in fact, today, the wind generation, not the capacity, but generation has exceeded the hydro generation in the US. So the next slide. By a few years ago, in fact, if we look at the levelized cost of energy, then wind and solar are already the cheapest energy sources, cheaper than gas, coal, petrol, and all the other sources. And therefore, the good news is that the renewable generation will occur at scale because the economics has flipped. The challenge is that the wind and solar are volatile and they are not controllable. The electric grid was designed with completely different kinds of generations. When the electric grid was designed and built starting, the previous slide, was built about 100 years, more than 100 years ago. The assumption is that the electricity generation is completely controllable and the loads are not very volatile. We can predict aggregate loads at a very high accuracy 24 hours in advance. And therefore, for the last more than 100 years, the way the grid works is that we forecast demand and then we schedule supply. to meet the demand. We don't really control the supply much, but we will control where and when generations occur, and that will change and that will be flipped when we have, say, 100% clean renewable sources. And in fact, the next slide. In California, we have committed to have 100% clean electricity by 2045 and have 5 million zero-emission vehicles, which mostly will be electric vehicles, 5 million of them by 2030. And there won't be any new internal combustion engine cells by after 2035. So that's the goal. And last year, there was a joint agency report to assess whether we can indeed achieve 100% clean electricity by 2045. And the main conclusion from this preliminary study is that it is achievable. The total resource cost is estimated to be only 67 billion per year in 2045. And moreover, the total resource cost for 100% clean electricity is only 6% more expensive in 2045 than if we had 60% clean renewable electricity, and which will be the 2030 target. And therefore, there's no reason not to have 100% clean electricity by 2045. Another interesting finding from the report is that the low flexibility can save about $1 billion per year in 2045. So this is basically where sort of the free money can come from. Just by being smart, we can save about $1 billion per year in California. And the research in my lab for the last decade has been focusing on the smart grid. That is, if we have 100% clean renewable electricity on the grid, how should the grid change? Not only the engineering, the operation of the electric grid, but also the market design, the market rules needs to be changed because of this 100% clean electricity transition. Next slide. Okay, so let me tell you one project that is in my lab is adaptive charging network. If we want to have widespread adoption, then we need to solve 3 challenges. One is the cost, and then the range, and the third is wide availability of EV charge. And this is the project that we worked on. Many people have contributed to this project, and I just want to acknowledge them. List here are some the co-founders of PowerFlex Tech startup and EDF Renewables a couple of years ago, and many generations of students, many of them undergraduates and also visiting students, SURF students that have contributed towards this project, as well as my PhD students. So next slide. Okay, the physical system we built is the first system that we built is in California garage, is near the gym. We built a system that consists of 250 kilowatt three-phase transformers, and then the breakers and conduits and so on. And the important thing, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, is a smart charger that was built by a former student, George Lee, using open source chipsets. That smart charger, unlike the chargers on the market, even today, I believe, the chargers that George built has the ability of real-time communication, computing, and actuation. And that allows us to use the algorithms that we design to control the smart charging that enables inexpensive large-scale EV charging. The cyber side, probably because of network delay. Okay, it's coming up. On the cyber system, it works as follows. When a driver plugs in her or his EV, it uses a mobile app to let the system know how much energy she needs, say 30 miles, and when does she expect to depart, say 5 p.m. in the afternoon. Taking this information, the system will form a optimization problem, what's called a quadratic constraint quadratic program, which some convex optimization problem, is solve this problem every minute to determine the charging rates for every EV in the garage for the next minute. And then the next minute comes around, you will repeat the process. You take the new network state, you will form a new QC/QP optimization problem, solve it, and get the optimal charging rate for the next minute, and so on. And the optimization problem is very flexible and can be tailored for different purposes depending on the site host. For example, you can charge in a way that is fastest. You can charge in a way that will maximally utilize the on-site solar generation, for example, or you can charge in a way that will minimize the electricity costs for the site. Next slide. Okay, so this is the just some pictures to show our first deployment. The curves was some simulation result before while we're designing the system before it was installed, and it saves both the capital cost and also the operating cost significantly over the state of the art in the industry. More interestingly, you can prove analytically that indeed the way we solve the problem using this what's called online linear program or quadratic program later on can indeed attain very close to the optimal that is possible. And all this work was built on very early work we did about 10 years ago on the theory of decentralized optimal control protocol for EV charging. So this shows our first deployment, February 2016. The picture in the middle is George and his brother working late at night, the night before the system was energized in mid-2016. And as I said, the idea is that by using smart EV charging algorithms, you can drastically reduce the end operating costs of large-scale EV charging. And this is important if you want to have, say, 500 EV chargers in a garage, instead of, say, 5 chargers in a garage. Next slide. Okay, it's operational since 2016. EX expanded to multiple garages by now, and it has delivered 1 gigawatt hour by July 2020, equivalent to more than 3 million miles, and saved about 1,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. And it was acquired by PowerFlex, was acquired by EDF Renewables, and now they have more than 10,000 chargers in the US, mostly in California. Next slide. Okay, so let me just show you a couple of interesting plots. This was a plot in 2016 when we did a demo at JPL to show that indeed you could control the EV charging in real time to match, for example, the PV generation. You can match it to other signals, such as, say, electricity tariff, for example. And this slide shows in blue curve is the real-time PV generation. And we control the EV charging, which is the yellow curve, to match the real-time PV generation. So that's a cloudy day, and therefore you can see the random fluctuations of the PV generation. And indeed, this is one of the main challenges for having renewable generation. And what you can see is that indeed you can control it quite well to match the PV generation, except during the lunch hour, say between say 12 o'clock or 11:30 and 2 p.m., when at the time we only have 8 chargers at JPL, and therefore during lunchtime there was just not enough EV charging at the time to match the PV generation. Otherwise, you can match it quite well. Now there are a lot more EV chargers, smart EV chargers at JPL. Okay, the final slide is coming up. Okay, so this one is a real deployment at NREL in 2018. So the lower left part, it shows the building load minus the PV. So you see this dip during the day because there's a lot of solar generation, but not a lot of building load. The big picture, the upper panel, you can still see the weekday net load in the blue. And therefore, you can still see this what's called a duck curve. And the goal is to control the net load, which is the building load minus the on-site PV plus the EV load, so that the total does not exceed, the peak load does not exceed 40 kilowatt, because businesses pay not only for the energy consumption, but also for the peak load. And therefore, we want to control the EV charging so that the total peak load is under a certain threshold. So I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I want to note that, Stephen, I believe you are broadcasting to us from Australia. Is that not right? Where
that's correct. That's why there's a long delay in the slide transition.
So Dr. Lowe really is coming to us from the future, which is tomorrow. So thank you so much. We'd like to bring back everyone back on, Gozda and Neil also, because we have so many questions from our viewers who are so smart and so concerned. So I thought that, you know, we'll kind of go from some very specific technical questions that have come in and then lens out to the larger, if you will. So and you can answer in any order, or if you wish. So Evan Hughes, BS 62 MS Physics, Menlo Park, California, asked, does biosphere engineering include 1, CO2 removal from the atmosphere, and 2, reflecting light and heat incoming radiation? Thoughts?
So I think I can take that. That's sort of a question about our research area. So ecology and biosphere engineering is really meant to look at the functioning of the natural and cultivated ecosystems. And so carbon removal is a part of it, in as much as plants and soils can be made to be net sinks or net sources of CO2, depending on the conditions that they are living in. And so we are using that sort of broad envelope to be able to study those as some of the things that Gozda talked about. And I should say, I didn't make this maybe very clear, those initiatives are sort of guidelines for how we think about the work that we do. Of course, there's a lot of overlap and interplay between them, and many of the research projects that we support have pieces that go across a few of those threads. The second part of the question around reflecting solar light or other things, both non-biological means of capturing and sequestering carbon dioxide, and also things like solar geoengineering, where you reflect some of the sunlights away from the planet so that it doesn't contribute to the heating. Those are areas that we're investigating largely under the climate science or possibly under the Sunlight to Everything initiative, if we are taking that carbon dioxide and making things with it. But we do have researchers that are investigating those areas.
So a couple of questions. First, I'll go to Stephen and then go to Gozda. Stephen, there's a question that is regarding how much do aging or failing electrical infrastructure combine to contribute to energy costs today? From Monterey, California, Eduardo Kotlink.
Yes, sorry, the network's a little bit. So how much, what?
I'm sorry. Do aging or failing elements of the electrical infrastructure contribute to energy costs?
I see. So the major concern of the operators, the system operators, is indeed the reliability of the operation, and therefore, whenever we turn on the switch, the light will come on, and therefore, there's a lot of cost that goes into the infrastructure. One aspect of that, and it's hard to pinpoint how much of that, say, electricity cost in electricity bill that we receive, how much of that goes to the infrastructure over decades, that build up over decades, and there's an investment every year, and there are also capacity planning every few years. Now it's more distributed because of the regulations and so on. So all of those contribute towards the final electricity bill that we receive, not just the operating cost in terms of fuel cost and so on. However, there's one indication one can look at, which is large-scale blackouts. And that happens, small-scale failures happen all the time, but large-scale blackouts are relatively rare, and that's why we see them in the news. But the estimate for the cost due to these blackouts, these are not electricity costs, but the cost of its impacts in addition to the repairs and everything, is estimated to be between $80 to $200 billion per year. So it is very significant. And of course, as the infrastructure ages, then the risk of blackout and the occurrence of failures of different kinds increases.
Great, and Ghost, I'm going to gang a couple of technical questions together for you, if we will. One comes from Harrison Leong, PhD 86, Engineering and Applied Science in San Francisco. And how about methods to increase supportive microbiomes in the soil? Is one we have. Let's see, and Mel Harapechian regarding the nanotube technology would also work to investigate the vascularization of gymnosperms. And why don't you start there, and I'll gang in more.
Okay, yeah, so I think the microbes are a great point, and that's definitely of interest to our lab, as well as some other newly emerging startups are working on that field as well. So I think it's a very promising strategy, because why not to take advantage of something that already exists in soil that have unique abilities. So what we could do is, I think first of all, we need to have a better understanding of how they interact with the plants and under what conditions, and then maybe have an understanding of what happens when we introduce a microbe there that's genetically engineered. How will it interact with the other organisms in the soil? But I do think it's a very promising approach, and I think it would make sense to tackle both sides of the problem by just not only looking at plants, but also involving microbes in that scenario. And I think there are a lot of efforts at Caltech as well, not only my lab, but Diane Newman's lab, as well as other people who are trying to look at the microbes under the soil for plants' benefit. The second part of the question, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but they were asking if we could use these nanoparticle technologies in regenerative pollen type of tissues to get heritable edits. So I think that's one of the next steps that we are trying to do. So far, we have been only doing with somatic tissues like leaves, which is good for showing things work. But if you want to make sure you can get the next generation of these improved plants, you need to be able to do these technologies in either tissues that will, like the germ cells that will give us the next generation, or doing it in undifferentiated tissues and then being able to differentiate them into the next generation full mature plants. So that's something we will focus on as well. It's trickier to be able to put things into germ cells because they are always hidden in the like most protective parts of the plants, because those are the most valuable tissues and organs. So it's hard to reach them even with using these advanced nanotechnologies. So that I think we need to improve some of our material capabilities to reach those tissues effectively.
One more for you, Ghost, before I go back to Stephen, and then we go back to Neil. This question comes from Daniel Whelan, BS 79, MS 81, PhD of Engineering and Applied Science, from Dana Point, California. Carver Mead was his faculty advisor. Carver Mead was a major figure in our luncheon presentation. So what impact is the anti-GMO movement having on the adoption of GMO plants? What are scientists doing to assuage the concerns of these folk? Neil's smiling. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and we should be, as scientists, we should play a role, I think, in that aspect as well, right? Not only to generate technologies, but to make sure that they are going to be adopted by the consumers and the public. So I think I would say like US is one of the places where we have more flexible regulation of genetically engineered crops. So when we do CRISPR genetic engineering to do brief knockout, like very, very small changes to the plant genome, when we do knockouts or when we insert a gene, say from pepper to tomato, these things are not regulated in the US currently as a GMO. So I feel like we have a bit more flexibility here compared to like Europe, for example. Any sort of manipulation is falling under GMO. So I think what we need to do is, as we develop these technologies, we need to talk to public about like what they are, what they involve, what are we doing exactly to these plants, and we need to do our best to convince that these are not any different than what the nature does over centuries, or, when they are under UV, they get constant mutations in their DNA, sometimes more drastic than what we do with our gene editing. So I think we need to make sure that these points are clear to the public, and hopefully my lab and folks at Caltech will also look at that side of the story.
Back to science communication, a theme of the day. All right, one more for you, Stephen. There are many questions here, so I'm boiling them down very quickly, and I apologize to you. And okay, Jonathan Melvin, PhD 75, comes to us from Culver City, California. Back to you, Stephen. We're all concerned. How do you handle a surge in charging needs? Unexpected number of people who need full charge early in the day on a particular day. On the same theme. Can you speak to that?
Right. So a great question. I think that in our case, we focus on workplace EV charging, and that is easier to handle because most of the time, most of the drivers, they will be regular employees or visitors, will be a small number of them. And therefore, from historical data, we can quite accurately predict their behavior, their arrival times, the departure times, the energy need. And that allows us to do it much more efficiently. Secondly, indeed, there are also fast DC fast chargers. So that will allow people, because they need to suddenly leave early, for example, they can use that. Now, that question will be much harder if you have, say, in a mall setting where the arrival, the departure, and the energy needs may vary a lot more and much less predictable. In those cases, what it means that you do need to provision bigger capacities to take care of those fluctuations. You have to have a lot more DC fast chargers that allow people to charge in a very fast manner. But at workplaces, that's much easier. They can be done much more efficiently with smart algorithms. And in fact, just one more thing is for those who are familiar with the duck curve problem, when we have 100% renewable, for example, then one of the main issue is the RAM. The second issue is when you have more and more EVs, then you will indeed add stress because it's a huge load compared with, say, the regular appliances in a household. However, if we do workplace EV charging, if we just look at the current duck curves for example, if you want to just feel the value of the duck EV charging, you can charge 13 million EVs. And therefore, you can actually combine the problem of duck curve and a lot of EV charging load in the future to have a solution.
In the future in Australia, which is you in the morning. I think two more questions as we lens back out to Neil. This one comes from Jan-BS63 from Silver Springs, Maryland. I'm trying to motivate universities to offer an MS degree in climate change risk and opportunity, and also for graduates to go into business at a senior level in order to help businesses assess climate risk and opportunity, necessity to move to a renewable economy and mitigate climate change. What are your thoughts on that in terms of a master's degree and mixing academia and business?
I think that's a great thing. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and you pointed out that I was smiling during one of the questions that you asked that goes to earlier, and that's because one of the challenges associated with climate change and energy and sustainable use of resources more generally is that it's a really complex landscape out in the real world, and we get to sit inside the lab and we can play sort of careful experiments or even semi-uncontrolled experiments, but to study these very particular aspects. And in the end, what we want to make sure that the researchers here on campus are doing is not just developing new tools and new capabilities that have never been seen before or new technologies that could be deployed, but really thinking about what barriers and roadblocks those technologies will see. And it's a different set of challenges for somebody like Stephen, who's working in this space where there's a huge energy infrastructure already in place and there are regulatory agencies that are already there. And it's an entirely different one for somebody coming at the field of genetic manipulation or bioengineering, where we know there's a huge problem and there's a sort of a lot of different ways that people are going about doing that. And one of the unique challenges at Caltech is, as everybody in the audience is an alum and is aware, we're a pretty small school and we're a pretty focused school. And so where a lot of our peer institutions that are also doing great work on the technical side also have established business schools or law schools or public policy schools, where there's academic research and practical research going on those sort of fronts related to the interaction between the technology and the community. We don't really have the same kind of infrastructure in place for that. And so part of the role that the Resnick Institute tries to play is to make those connections directly, so that, as Gozda was saying, as researchers are coming up with new technologies, they're not doing it in complete isolation from where those spaces are. So coming back to the specific question, I think having educational programs, and we're seeing this from our students, especially the undergrads, but also the graduate students, as they come in and they want to take these technical courses of study that are what Caltech is known for. They also want to do that in the broader context of these sort of societal challenges. And so we are trying to develop, as the Resnick Institute expands, educational opportunities at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level that allow the students who are working on these technical problems to also take a step back and understand the business, either through internships or through programs to study the economics of various different technological improvements or the challenges with regulating some of these hard to regulate markets. But that's a process. But I encourage you, that's a great job to try and do that anywhere and everywhere. I think the more that students can understand and interact in those things, the better.
And I think that makes a great point as we close to address Brian von Hertzen, a second generation techer, that the center is not avoiding siloing, which seems to be what your sustainability center, the Resnick Sustainability Center, is doing. Silos. Agricultural? No, it's a metaphor. So thanks so much. You've stimulated so much interest from viewers. I know the conversation will continue. So thanks so much, Neil, Stephen, and Gozda. That was extraordinary. Thank you. And to the rest, we'll see you in 15 minutes, 2:15 for our final session. Multum in parvo. Should be exciting. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
By the way, I enjoy your NPR show.